Stalin sent him away, the man who had just accepted Germany's surrender, 13 months after the war ended. The official reason was vague, the private reason was documented in a Politburo file. He had become too popular. The file did not use those words. Every document in it described exactly that. What Zhukov wrote about Stalin during the exile years was removed from his published memoir by Soviet censors in 1969. The uncensored passages were published in 1992, 17 years after his death. They said something the official record had never permitted a Soviet marshal to say in print. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, June 1946, Moscow, 4 times hero of the Soviet Union. The commander who had held Moscow in December 1941 when the city was 3 days from falling. Who had commanded at Stalingrad, who had led the assault on Berlin, who had stood on the steps of the Reichstag and watched Germany surrender, sent to Odessa, then to the Urals, while Stalin's investigators built their file. The file is in the Russian State Archive in Moscow. The uncensored memoir is in libraries. The gap between what was permitted to be published in 1969 and what was finally published in 1992 is specific and documented. Both versions exist. The difference between them is this episode. October 1941, German forces were 40 miles from Moscow. The Soviet government had partially evacuated the city. Stalin had stayed, a calculation about what the population needed to see. He called Zhukov back from the Leningrad front and gave him command of the defense of Moscow. The city had perhaps a week before the German advance reached its outskirts. The defense of Moscow is documented in Soviet operational records at the Russian State Military Archive. Zhukov's specific command decisions, the placement of reserves, the timing of the counterattacks, the choice of which sectors to hold thin, are recorded in the war diaries of the formations involved. The German advance was stopped. The counteroffensive in December 1941 pushed them back. Moscow did not fall. Stalingrad, the operation that encircled and destroyed the German Sixth Army in the winter of 1942-1943, was planned at the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, with Zhukov as Deputy Supreme Commander. The operational plan, codenamed Uranus, is documented in the Stavka operational files. It produced the surrender of Field Marshal Paulus and approximately 300,000 German soldiers. The name Zhukov became synonymous with the victory that turned the war. Berlin, April-May 1945. Zhukov commanded the First Belarusian Front, the central axis of the final Soviet assault on the German capital. The battle ended on May 2, 1945, when the Berlin garrison surrendered. 3 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Zhukov represented the Soviet Union at the German Instrument of Surrender on May 8, 1945. He signed his name beside the Allied commanders. The war in Europe was over. On June 24, 1945, Zhukov commanded the Victory Parade in Moscow, riding a white horse down Red Square while Stalin watched from the Lenin Mausoleum. The newsreel footage of that parade was shown across the Soviet Union and the Allied world. The man on the white horse was not Stalin. That image, Zhukov on the white horse, Stalin watching, was the beginning of a problem that the official record did not acknowledge for decades. Stalin had survived the war. He had made decisions that contributed to its near-catastrophic opening, the purges of the officer corps in 1937-1938, the refusal to heed intelligence warnings about the German invasion, the paralysis of the first days after June 22, 1941. The official Soviet record did not record those decisions accurately. What it did record, in every newspaper and every official history, was the name of the commander who had reversed the consequences of those decisions. That name was not Stalin's. What happened next was never in the official Soviet account published during Stalin's lifetime. In the months after the Victory Parade, Stalin's apparatus started collecting material, testimony from officers, reports from the NKVD, assessments from political officers embedded in military commands. The material was being collected about one specific person. The NKVD had been monitoring Zhukov since at least 1946. Partially declassified files from this period, referenced in Dmitry Volkogonov's research materials held at the Library of Congress, document the surveillance operation. The accusations being assembled had 3 components: that he had exaggerated his own role in the key operations of the war, that he had shown what the Soviet system called Bonapartist tendencies, personal ambition threatening to exceed institutional loyalty, and that he had taken trophy property from Germany after the victory. The third charge was the one the file used. The first 2 were the ones that mattered. In June 1946, the Higher Military Council convened in Moscow. The transcript of the meeting exists and has been referenced in post-Soviet historical scholarship. Zhukov was present. The accusations were presented formally, that he had minimized Stalin's role in the key victories, that he had claimed credit that belonged to the Supreme Command, that his conduct showed dangerous personal ambition. He denied the charges. The council voted to remove him from his position as Commander-in-Chief of Soviet land forces. He was sent to command the Odessa military district. From Commander-in-Chief of Soviet land forces, the highest military command in the state that had just won the largest war in history, to a regional command in a provincial city on the Black Sea. He went to Odessa, he understood what it meant. In 1948 he was moved further, the Ural military district. The posting was not a prison. He retained his rank and his formal military status, but the message was precise. He was far from Moscow, far from any command that mattered, and there he would remain for as long as Stalin lived. Stalin was 68 years old in 1947. Zhukov was 51. He had time. He commanded the Ural military district with the same professional discipline he had applied to every command. The officers who served under him during this period documented later that he was precise, demanding, and gave no public indication of bitterness. He performed the duties of his posting. He also wrote. What he wrote during these years was not for publication. It was not for the Soviet censors. It was for himself, and possibly for whoever might eventually be permitted to read it. He was still the man who had accepted the German surrender, who had commanded at Stalingrad and Berlin and Moscow, who had been given more operational responsibility in the most consequential war in Soviet history than any other commander. He had not changed. What had changed was that the war was over, and Stalin no longer needed what only Zhukov could provide. The memoir he began writing during the exile years went through multiple drafts over 2 decades. What the censors received in 1969 and what was permitted to be published were different documents. The changes were not minor corrections. They were the removal of specific passages, specific assessments of specific decisions made by specific people. The people whose decisions were assessed were Stalin and the political leadership of the Soviet state. The 1969 edition of Vоспоминания и размышления, Reminiscences and Reflections, was published by the state publishing house Novosti. It sold millions of copies. It was translated into multiple languages. It described the key operations of the war from Zhukov's perspective, within limits that the Soviet system still enforced even after Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation of Stalin. What the censors removed is documented by comparison. Post-Soviet researchers examining the original manuscript against the published edition identified specific passages that had been altered or deleted. The passages described Stalin's role in the catastrophic opening of the war, the purges that destroyed the officer corps, the failure to prepare for the German invasion despite documented intelligence warnings, the paralysis of the first days of Barbarossa. Zhukov had written his direct assessment of those decisions. The assessment did not appear in 1969. The uncensored version was published in 1992. It contained the passages removed in 1969. They described Stalin's responsibility for the disasters of 1941 in direct terms. They described the fear that pervaded the Soviet high command, officers who knew what the correct operational decision was and would not make it because they had seen what happened to officers who told Stalin something he did not want to hear. Zhukov had been one of the few who told him anyway. He had written down what that cost. Stalin died on March 5, 1953. Within weeks of his death, Zhukov was recalled to Moscow and appointed first Deputy Minister of Defense. The man who had been sent to the Urals to keep him away from power was returned to Moscow because the men who had sent him there now needed someone with genuine military authority in their own internal power struggle. Khrushchev used Zhukov's military authority and popular reputation as a counterweight to Beria. Beria was arrested in June 1953. Zhukov's physical presence at the arrest is documented. Zhukov served as defense minister from 1955 to 1957 before Khrushchev removed him in turn for the same category of reasons Stalin had used. He had become too independent, too popular, too difficult to control. The pattern that had begun in 1946 repeated itself 11 years later with a different leader doing the removing. Zhukov died on June 18, 1974. He was 77 years old. He had lived long enough to see the 1969 version of his memoir published and to know what had been removed from it. He did not live to see the 1992 version. The passages he had written during the exile years in the Urals, about the fear in the high command, about the paralysis of 1941, about the cost of telling Stalin the truth, appeared in print 17 years after his death. The Politburo file from 1946 is in the Russian State Archive of Social and Political History in Moscow. The NKVD surveillance records are partially declassified. The original memoir manuscript with the censors' marks is in the Russian State Archive system. The 1992 published edition is in libraries. The German surrender document that Zhukov signed on May 8, 1945 is in the Bundesarchiv. The file that sent him to the Urals and the document that ended the war are in the same archive system. They were generated by the same state. He is buried at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. The 1992 memoir is in print. The Politburo file from 1946 is in the archive. Stalin sent him to the Urals to keep those passages from being written. They were written anyway. He did not choose what went in the archive. He chose what went in the memoir. The archive holds both.